Okay, hello. Today we're going to discuss Mary Shelley, her novel, and some critical background contextual information. So let's start with the most important aspect here. Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. And you'll notice in this 1818 edition, we're told that there's a subtitle, The Modern Prometheus, that has significance. The novel was given to the public in 3 volumes. There's an epigraph from John Milton's Paradise Lost. And you'll notice that there is no author on the cover. So Mary Shelley published Frankenstein in 1818 anonymously. So there was a lot of question as to who published this work. And that's why the epigraph, the dedication, these are all crucial clues for the public and for us to determine who may be the author of this work. Let's look at Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, born in 1797, dies in 1851. Her full name is Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley, and I'm only giving you her birth name, as it were. But Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley, as her full name testifies, was the daughter of William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, and later the wife of Percy Bysshe Shelley. Most of us will be familiar with her novel Frankenstein, and maybe also her literary intimacies with the so-called second generation of British Romantic poets, namely Percy Shelley and Lord Byron. What is less known is the effect of her parents' writings on Mary Shelley's works, especially her literary dialogues with her father's writings. Her father is William Godwin. She was his daughter. Mary Shelley was the daughter of 2 celebrated radical thinkers of the 1790s. You will recall that both William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft were part of the 1790s pamphlet war and discussing the French Revolution and Britain's situation at that time. So Mary Shelley inherited this intellectual legacy of her parents, but also their private pain and sufferings, part of which were made public in William Godwin's 1798 tribute to his wife, Mary Wollstonecraft. This is a very short book called Memoirs of the Author of a Vindication of the Rights of Woman. You will notice that Godwin is not writing a tribute to my wife. He's not writing a tribute to Mary Wollstonecraft. He's actually writing a tribute to the author of a Vindication of the Rights of Woman. That already signals that Godwin was celebrating Mary Wollstonecraft's writings and public persona. This was a tribute that was written shortly after the birth of Mary Shelley and the death of Mary Wollstonecraft. And it is because of this tribute that we have all of the private, personal details of how Mary Wollstonecraft met William Godwin, Mary Wollstonecraft's early life, her views, her previous relationships, and also how she died giving birth to Mary Shelley. And in fact, we know quite a lot of details about William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft's life, because William Godwin kept what, for all intents and purposes, we could call a sex diary. Basically, he indicated when him and Mary Wollstonecraft slept together, whether it was at his place or her place. He would use French. He would say chez moi, chez nous, to indicate where. And because of that sort of he charted it all out. So because of that, we could tell that they were practicing the rhythm method, and we can actually tell exactly when Mary Shelley was conceived. So there's a way in which this family is incredibly public, but also, in terms of their writing and their output, they have a lot of it. So we can tell a lot of personal things about Mary Shelley's life based on this one slim tribute. And we also see the tragedy of of Mary Wollstonecraft's death, and it's the details of Mary Shelley's birth are incredibly medical. Godwin gives a very practically gynecological, detailed, point by point description of Mary Wollstonecraft giving birth to Mary Shelley and how the placenta didn't come out and then she got infected, and how they had to actually use puppies to suckle the milk off of Mary Wollstonecraft while they were waiting for Mary Wollstonecraft to heal from an infection. But of course, none of this worked, and she died 10 days after giving birth to Mary Shelley. So this Memoirs of the Author of Vindication of Rights of Woman, becomes the preeminent source book for everything we know about Mary Wollstonecraft's relationship with William Godwin, as well as Mary Shelley's birth and her conception. And if you think about Victor Frankenstein and his creature, the creature actually learns about his birth and his creation, birth, through Victor's diary. And so there is some resemblance there in terms of what's going on. What you want to keep in mind, too, is that Mary Shelley, her knowledge of her mother comes only through the written word. Mary Shelley read everything her mother had written, but everything her mother had written in terms of her fictional output, not the Vindication of the Rights of Man and the Vindication of the Rights of Woman, but Mary Wollstonecraft's fiction that she wrote after those two polemical political treatises. Her fiction was edited and published by William Godwin. So if you're trying to think about the sort of literary fictional legacy that Mary Wollstonecraft leaves for her daughter, that fictional legacy is mediated through William Godwin's editing and publishing. So there's a real way in which Mary Shelley inherits her father and her mother's literary output, but always mediated through the father. The father wrote a ton of work, both fictional novels as well as political works. And in fact, Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein has the same structure in terms of embedded narrative and tales told by men to other men as William Godwin's first fictional work called Caleb Williams, which was published in 1794. So Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein is often read as a Godwinian novel. Godwin had a kind of type that he used in terms of a type meaning he had a narrative form in his fictional work. And Mary Shelley replicates that narrative form in a lot of her own work. That's why we could talk about a genre such as the Godwinian novel, and we can see Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as fitting into that particular genre. Let's go to Mary and Percy Shelley and their particular relationship. So you'll read in your introduction a lot of details about how Percy Shelley was already married, already had children by the time he met Mary Shelley, and the sort of tragedy of Harriet Westbrook, Percy Shelley's first wife, who committed suicide by drowning and so on. But the details for Mary Shelley and Frankenstein is actually Lake Geneva, 1816. And this was considered a year without a summer. This particular year, 1816, was so, there was a volcanic eruption, and it caused a lot of sort of climate change activities in 1816, so much so that even in the daytime, in the summertime, you had to light candles in different parts of Europe. And so that's why it's a kind of the year without summer. It's a kind of gloomy atmosphere that would be the perfect backdrop for a Gothic novel, or for someone considering, the kind of devastation that would sort of produce a creature. So it's important to remember in Lake Geneva that year without a summer exactly what was going on in terms of. So 1816, the year without a summer, is a crucial year to keep in mind. That was the year that created the circumstances that were the initial ideas for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And this is the year that, because of a lot of climate change and other environmental catastrophes and disasters, it created the perfect backdrop for Mary Shelley even pondering something like Frankenstein. Let's look at our next person here, Lord Byron and the Villa Diodati. Lord Byron, a good friend of Percy Shelley's, would rent the summer house in Villa Diodati in the off of Lake Geneva. And the Shelleys went to England because after the sort of elopement of P.B. Shelley with Mary Shelley and a kind of outcry from the public concerning Mary Shelley eloping with a already married man who was the son of a aristocrat, and the sort of fallout from all of that, they just escaped to Italy and to Switzerland just to get away from everything. And so Lord Byron rented the Villa Diodati, and this is where they had the infamous ghost story competition, where one night Byron basically said, you know, as Byron and Mary Shelley, her half-sister Claire Clement also joined them. She later had a relationship with Byron and had a child and so on. But she was also there, as well as Lord Byron's doctor, someone named John Polidori, and as well as Percy Shelley. And because they had to light candles in the middle of the day, the atmosphere was gloomy, it was stormy. Byron one night basically suggested, why don't we try a ghost story competition, and whoever comes up with the best tale, you know, we'll sort of see what we can do about that. And Byron, the inspiration of the climate, he wrote a poem called Darkness that came out of that one night. Polidori, if we go to John Polidori, who was Byron's doctor, because of this one night of the ghost story competition, he started writing a very short tale on the vampire, which eventually got published in 1819. Here's the cover, called The Vampire, a Tale. And on the cover, it says it's by Lord Byron, because John Polidori was not a literary writer. He was not known for anything. He was just Byron's doctor. Later on, we found out it was actually Polidori who wrote this. The Vampire is a very slim tale, but it's worth reading because it is the precursor and the literary influence on Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is published at the end of the 19th century. And Mary Shelley started thinking about Frankenstein, and she actually starts with the sort of scary night and what that might mean. So the ghost story competition, you'll read in Mary Shelley's 1831 introduction, she says, and this is a quote, "I busied myself to think of a story to rival those which had excited us to the task, one which could speak to the mysterious fears of our nature and awaken thrilling horror, one to make the reader dread to look around, to curdle the blood and quicken the beating of the heart." And so that was Mary Shelley's contribution. And this is one of the original drawings. You can see the creature and then Victor and, you know, the whole idea of the creature being made of dead body parts. But also notice that there's a book here in the corners. So the written word and being influenced by words and writing is very important to these writers. Let's go to Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. What's important to keep in mind with Frankenstein is that until the 1970s, only the 1831 version, which is Mary's version that she wrote after P.B. Shelley died from drowning in 1822, was available. And that 1831 version actually was edited and changed to fit the sort of morality of the Victorian time period. It's the 1818 version that was published anonymously that is really the Romantic era version. The Romantic era version. That's the one we want to pay attention to, because the 1831 version actually gets rid of the incest and other kinds of things which are very evident in the 1818 version. Mary also made some changes in 1826 to her edition of Frankenstein, which she gave as a present. And so we know those versions as well. But the 1818 version is the one that we should really focus on, because that was what she wanted to, those were her words that she wanted to get across. Not that the 1831 wasn't, but the 1831 version actually is taking into consideration the critical reception, the times, the reviews, and so on. The novel, as it was originally conceived, is really the greatest example of Romantic period writing. It's also the greatest Gothic novel in terms of its use of the supernatural. Gothic novels tend to have use the sort of climate and atmosphere as a scary backdrop. You have the kind of laboratory where Victor creates this creature that's very Gothic-like. In Gothic novels, you would have a castle, but in this novel, Victor's lab kind of functions that way. And think about that when we talk about Dr. Jekyll and Hyde, because the lab is important there as well, and it's a Gothic element. And this is Mary Shelley's 1818 novel is also the first example of science fiction. She, in fact, it's because of this novel that the genre of science fiction started. So there's a way in which Mary Shelley's 1818 Frankenstein inaugurates or initiates various different kinds of genres, and many have come back to the 1818 version to discuss all sorts of issues in later works. Now let's look at the literary context. I have here a list of the key writers who influenced Mary Shelley and whose influence we can see in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. John Milton's influence is clear from the epigraph, and one of you will be, or all of you will be actually working on, trying to figure out what exactly is his influence in the novel itself. But there is this whole relationship between God and, God as maker and his creature, Adam, and sort of how that plays out in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, as some of you will know, wrote Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And that is a poem that is the first poem in William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge's 1798 collection of poetry called Lyrical Ballads. That collection opens with Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And Rime of the Ancient Mariner is basically about a sailor who has been traumatized by what he has witnessed on board ship, and he feels compelled to keep telling his story over and over again, particularly at weddings. So he finds a wedding guest and then he tells his story. So there is this whole notion of retelling a tale or retelling a tale of horror over and over again in order to get some sort of salvation. That's what's going on in Rime of the Ancient Mariner. You will recall that in Frankenstein, we do have Robert Walton on board ship, and then he finds Victor Frankenstein, who will tell him the tale of creating this creature. William Wordsworth is also a big influence on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. There's a lot of description of mountains, of Mont Blanc in particular, of the creature traveling through the mountains and experiencing the sublime. William Wordsworth was a nature poet, but also somebody who really felt that in nature you can experience what he called the sublime, a kind of awe, but also, a sort of, you are in awe of nature, but you're also afraid of nature. And it also helps you to connect to your higher soul and your higher being, your imagination. That's sort of what is called the Wordsworthian egotistical sublime, because it's always about Wordsworth and the Wordsworthian poet. You see some of that in Victor Frankenstein. Victor might be a scientist, Wordsworth is a poet, but both of them have this kind of egotistical sublime where it's always about them and their imagination and their higher self and their, poetic, imaginative, creative selves. William Blake is also a poet of the Romantic period who wrote songs of innocence and of experience. He had this whole notion of how, as people, we move from this naivete and this innocence, then we experience life, and that's how we get a sort of organized experience that maintains the optimism of innocence, but is not so naive and ignorant. It actually has incorporated experience to now have what Blake would think of as organized experience. And there's a way in which in Frankenstein, from Victor's idealistic desire to create life to the actual experience of creating life, where he's shocked and horrified, that shows you his ignorance, his sort of innocence in terms of, life. And then does he ever learn anything from that? I mentioned before, William Godwin, her father, had the Godwinian novel. William Godwin's novels tend to be very closed, a small set of characters, very intense circumstances. William Godwin's novels, the fictional novels, were psychological tales. So the psychological novel in fiction really starts with William Godwin. And we see that again in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It is a psychological tale. There are not that many characters, if you think about it, in terms of the size of that novel. And it's very intense and closed off. It's all this sort of telling of stories among men. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote two short pieces of fiction. One was called Mary. The other one was called Maria, or The Wrongs of Woman. And both of them do try to wrestle with gender issues and the particularity of being a woman in a patriarchal society. And in fact, in Mary Wollstonecraft's fiction, Maria, or The Wrongs of Woman, the woman is married and is imprisoned by her husband because she tries to escape an abusive husband. And she's not allowed to take her daughter. But the husband, this is a time period where there is no such thing as abuse, right? So husbands are allowed to do whatever they want with their wives. So if the husband wants to abuse the wife, and if she runs away, then he can reclaim her, just like, reclaiming your property. And in Mary Wollstonecraft's Maria, or The Wrongs of Woman, she does say at one point that she has been bastilled for life, that marriage is a kind of prison, and she has been bastilled for life. She's using the reference to the Bastille prison, but saying that marriage is like that. So you might think about how that plays out in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because you do have a lot of female characters who end up tragically in terms of their outcomes, whether it's Justine, Caroline Beaufort, or Elizabeth Lavenza, all have tragic deaths. Percy Bysshe Shelley, he wrote a poem called Alastor, which was all about the poet striving to find his higher self by journeying and traveling to different places. And at some point in Alastor, the poet actually finds his better self, but the better self is a veiled Arabian woman. So it's interesting that is happening in P.B. Shelley's poem, because that also, to a certain extent, is what's going on in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein with the character of Saifi. And whether she's Turkish, Arabian, Muslim, Christian is debatable, because she's somehow a mixture of all those things. So there was a lot of literary influence that informs Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And there's a lot of ways in which Frankenstein is critiquing all of these writers. Let's look at Victor Frankenstein himself. So a couple of interesting things to note about the novel itself. The novel opens in 1798. So the audience at that time period, as well as us, cannot ignore that date. That date was a date that, we actually had the publication of Wordsworth and Coleridge's lyrical ballads. 1798, of course, is also the year of Napoleon's war with England, and also conquering Italy. So there's a way in which to start a novel in 1798. And this is when Victor is rescued from near death by Walton, the explorer, in the North Pole. To begin a novel in 1798 is really to begin a novel in a political way, because you're pointing to the Napoleonic Wars. Now, Victor's own birth actually is in the 1770s. So we go back. So Victor's story begins with his birth in Geneva in the 1770s. And this is significant because Geneva is the home of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose Political writings were infamous and a huge influence on Frankenstein. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is the one who talked about the natural man. And he also talked about the importance of education for male children, but not for females. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had nothing to say about women. In fact, all he said is that women, Sophie, that was the character in his work, they should be raised to serve at the pleasure of the man. But the man, Emile, has all of this kind of education he has to have. So the fact that Victor's story starts with his birth in Rousseau's city in the 1770s is really pointing to that influence. Finally, Victor's scientific studies begin in 1789. So we can't miss the political context. 1789, July 14th, 1789 is the storming of the Bastille prison that inaugurates the French Revolution and really starts the very turbulent 1790s decade of war and horror and the reign of terror and so on. So none of these dates and contexts are clearly indicated in the novel, but scholars reading exactly the circumstances in the novel can tell that these were the dates, and readers of Mary Shelley's novel in 1818 would have detected all these signs of these dates, and they would have, totally understood the turbulence that Mary Shelley's novel was pointing to. And keep in mind that, and you know this from our previous lecture, that the word monster was used by Burke to target those who were sympathetic to the French Revolution. And the word monster was also used by Wollstonecraft, Godwin, and Tom Paine to target the Burkean types who were against the French Revolution. So in a way, Mary Shelley's novel is taking the discussion, the ideas that were circulating in the pamphlet war, and she's making them concrete. So she takes all of those ideas and gives you a full, blooded monster. So that's a way of thinking about the political backdrop for Mary Shelley's creature. Finally, the critical reception. The original 1818 edition, most people thought, because of the introduction, or rather the preface by Percy Bysshe Shelley, that this was a novel written either by Percy Bysshe Shelley or maybe by William Godwin, because it followed the Godwinian novel. So they welcomed the novel. They said that the novel was well written, it was a thrilling tale, and so on. When reviewers discovered that it was actually a novel written by a woman, the reviews completely changed. All of a sudden, the reviewers were talking about the poor writing, the lack of, plot devices to make it thrilling, and they just pointed to all sorts of errors that they never did before when they thought it was written by William Godwin or Percy Bysshe Shelley. So you could see that there was a very gendered reception to this novel. Keep in mind that this is still the time period where very few women write, and women feel compelled to use a pseudonym to write. Even later in the century, Marianne Evans, when she wrote Middlemarch, Silas Marner, and Mill on the Floss, she did not write under her name Marianne Evans. She wrote under George Eliot. As most of you will know, George Eliot, famous Victorian writer, writing at the same time as Charles Dickens, could not, and this is in the Victorian period, could not even write with their own name. So there was this whole problem with female authorship. I've already talked about the difference between the 1826 and the 1831 editions. The 1831 edition gets rid of the incest. In the 1818 edition, Elizabeth Lavenza is Victor Frankenstein's first cousin. And so the idea that those two would get married is, at this time, has that incestuous appeal. By 1831, Elizabeth Lavenza is an orphan who is adopted into the Frankenstein family and is still raised to marry Victor Frankenstein, but slightly different because there's no blood relation. Let's just go to female authorship, the canon, and feminism for a second. So Mary Shelley's works, Frankenstein, was so well known, and was so well received after the 1831 edition that it became the sort of sign or signifier of what women could do. But at the same time, when you look at the literary canon, there are very few authors you can point to. It would generally be Mary Shelley, maybe Jane Austen, and then Virginia Woolf in the modernist period, and that would be it. There's a way in which Mary Shelley broke the barrier, if you will, but perhaps because her tale has very little to do with female characters or female issues, and I'll get to that in a minute. It's about men by men talking to men about creating a man. So there's a way in which she broke through the glass ceiling, but this is also a problem as we think about the canon. Mary Shelley's novel has also been read in terms of feminism. These sort of you can read it in terms of the problems with birth and what happens when a man takes over the birthing and bypasses women, the biological, to create something. They will create something supernatural and monstrous. And so there's been a lot of scholarship looking at Victor's creation in terms of a kind of distorted birthing procedure or birthing situation, because his laboratory, the way it's a sort of Gothic lab, it kind of mimics the sort of female biological organs, fallopian tubes, and so on. The way in which Victor gets weaker and sicker, that is the opposite of what happens to women when they're pregnant. The seasons as they pass. And then Victor's a horrible parent. He totally abandons his duties and responsibilities to his child. So Mary Shelley's, work, both in terms of she as a writer who was affiliated with all these very famous male writers and still was able to publish and write. And she wrote a ton of novels after Frankenstein. Lots of novels, lots of short stories, lots of biographies and historical work. And she wrote a ton. And to do that in the milieu of male writers is seen as a sign for feminism in terms of, notable female writers. So in the canon, Mary Shelley holds a very important place. Finally, in terms of films and popular culture, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein has never, ever been out of print. So since its first edition in 1818, it has never, ever been out of print. And there has been literally untold millions of rewrites and homages and modifications and works that really owe their influence to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. There's been tons, not only in film and pop culture, in media and everything, to the point where Franken is a prefix that we apply to everything. We talk about Frankenfood, that's GMO food and so on. So Mary Shelley's work has been astronomical in terms of its, legacy, or rather another way to put it, Mary Shelley's work has been phenomenal in terms of its influence in our modern day and age, not only in terms of thinking about what we think about today in terms of DNA and biological sort of manipulations and so on, which you see, by the way, in Never Let Me Go, but also in all sorts of other ways in terms of scientific, popular scientific depictions of humans and what it means to be human. She really inaugurated that whole situation, that whole literary perception. So that is Mary Shelley, and you can see in the background, one of the more famous Hollywood depictions of the creature, that's Boris Karloff in the famous Frankenstein movie. There's been untold movies, even something like Frankenweenie, for children, owes its, sort of narrative to Mary Shelley's novel. So what we're going to investigate after all this is really how does Mary Shelley's novel live on in the subsequent literary tales that we are looking at in this course.